All right, welcome. Today, we're going to talk about some yoga class management stuff. So this was suggested by Megan, and she wanted to talk about what to do when unexpected things or disrupting things happen in class. Burps, farts, crying, snoring, cell phones ringing, gigglers at the back of the class, early leavers. And a lot of those things can create a lot of anxiety for our students. They worry about, what if I fall asleep and snore in meditation? What if I fart in the middle of class? Like, what will happen to me? So we want to address that. And for us as teachers, we also can get anxious and want to learn about how do we manage overall our class culture, but also how do we manage behavior or unexpected events that can disrupt a class. So it's kind of a big conversation, but we'll get to as much as we can today. If there's time, we'll also talk a little bit maybe about some risk management, but that's probably something we'll talk about next week, just because they're larger conversations. So firstly, there's two kind of mantras that I think are useful when dealing with this kind of class management. And the first is say it out loud. If something obvious is happening, address it, or even anticipate it if you can. It's often not helpful if something obvious is happening in class that's obviously disrupting students, and you as a teacher are pretending that it's not happening. It can be better to say it out loud, kindly, whatever it is, address it, and then chart a new course for the rest of the class. The second is, if in doubt, refer. So if a student needs support or care that's outside your role, it's important that you refer them to someone who can help, that you don't try to take control of a situation that's outside of your scope. So those are two things to keep in mind as we go through a couple scenarios, a couple ideas for class management. So first, let's talk about the eruptions that can happen in class. So that's burping, farting, crying, snoring. And here's where say it out loud is helpful. If you remember your first forays into yoga, you might remember feeling anxious about just fitting in, doing things right, wearing the right clothes, what to do when you arrive at class, the dreaded, what if I fart? These are all concerns that your students have. So say it out loud, even before students come to class. Have it in your pre-class information that you email or text, have it on your website. Make a video talking about all the things that might be of a concern and why they're not concerns for you or how they can be addressed. I think it's really useful to let students know what to expect and what they can expect from you. So walk them through the process of arriving at class step by step. Not everybody wants or needs all that information, but for those who do, it's so helpful. It's so helpful in guiding them into class and letting them feel safe and letting them feel seen by anticipating what some of their concerns might be. Then at the start of class, you might open with a little brief on what to expect from yoga, maybe, especially if this is a beginner specific class. You might talk about how things arise, burps, farts, tears, and that all of that is acceptable. And that you don't have to hold anything in yoga. This is a place where you can express yourself, where you can be where you're at today, which is sometimes tidy and tucked in, and sometimes it's a bit messy, and yoga can take us as we are. I think especially if you've got a class community that gets together regularly, it's nice to address that and say, all of us in this room together can hold space for each other for those days where, you know, maybe you're showing up a little messier, maybe there's a lot more tears on a day. We can hold space for that. So that's something that you can offer. You might point out, like, the tissue box. If tears come, that's okay. Crying happens in yoga. There's tissues there if you need it. You might talk about how you're available for support if they need it. So all they have to do maybe is make eye contact with you or put a hand up and you'll be on your way. Now, when it comes to farts, if you are a juvenile like me, when someone does a real roaring fart in class, it's funny, right? So you might have to really exert some self-control in that situation. You kind of have to feel out your class culture and the character of the farter and the control of the farties. So do you mention it or not? If in doubt, just flow on with your class. But if the farter's giggling, you can make a light point. Yeah, don't hold anything back in yoga, you know, let it flow and then just move on with your class, right? So your conduct lets other students know how to behave in the face of things like farts, right? So it's light, it's funny, farts happen, we move on, we refocus. We don't point anyone out or make anyone feel bad, right? So when does an eruption turn into disruption? One example is when a student is in obvious distress, right? And also when the eruptions are enough to start to distract other students. So an example of that might be snoring. Sometimes people fall asleep in class and they snore, right? A bit of snoring is no issue. And you might even address that at the start of class about distractions, especially if you're teaching in spaces like a gym, or if there's a lot of noise outside your space. You might talk about how, you know, there might be distractions, there might be noises, you can just let them float by. They don't have to enter your meditation experience, right? So then if there is some light snoring, that's an acceptable challenge to people's focus and attention, to the other students. But if someone's snoring and it's really disturbing people, you have a few options on how to address it. Depending on where you're at in your relaxation timing, you might re-enter the meditation and speak a bit, which will help wake them up, and then reset the meditation. So that might be something like, if your mind has wandered off, come back to the breath. Then maybe guide a breathing technique. That might be counting the breath, or it might be a progressive relaxation. Give everyone's minds a job to do, to kind of wake everyone up, refocus everyone, and then you can guide them back into whatever your meditation or your relaxation is going to be. In the past, I used to go and touch the snorer's toe to wake them. Now I know better that particularly for trauma sensitivity, that might not be the best option and might not be the best thing to do, to creep around the room touching people when they're relaxing. But sometimes it's the only option if you can't gently wake them with your voice. Sometimes you get real deep sleepers in meditation and everyone else is awake and they're fast asleep. And in that situation, you might go and just touch their toe or move closer to them and use your voice to wake them and bring them back. Is it in your pre-meditation instructions? If you fall asleep and you're snoring, I might come by and just touch your toe just to wake you up, you know, and you might even offer some other instructions. If you're likely to fall asleep, if you tend to fall asleep, here's some things you can do. You can have them sit with their back against the wall. You can prop them up on a leaning bolster. Sometimes people are snoring not because they're asleep, but because when they deeply relax, their throat makes snores, right? So those are all things that you can address at the beginning of class. The one place where I wouldn't be moving around the room is if I was teaching a specific trauma sensitive class. If I'm teaching frontline yoga or a trauma sensitive class, I'm not leaving my mat. And that's a contract that I have with my students at the start. So if there's snoring, there's going to be snoring. And you know what? We're here to develop sense management, and that might just be the sense management challenge. Now, I have had students who are chronic snorers where I've had to have a private conversation so as not to point them out or embarrass them, but have a quick private conversation after class. Listen, you snore a lot in class. What can we do to make meditation really comfortable for you where there isn't snoring? And again, that's where props can be really useful. Again, a leaning bolster so they're not lying flat can often reduce the amount of snoring noises that someone makes. And, you know, similar issues come up depending on the space that you're teaching in. If you're teaching in a gym, there can be clangs and grunts and all kinds of noise happening outside your teaching space. So then you do need to say that out loud. It needs to become part of your instructions, that when we're in relaxation, there's still the work of not letting distractions enter into and color our meditation. So letting them float by like clouds or whatever your instruction is going to be, and managing your senses in that way. So that's something to think about. Yeah, with crying. So let's talk about crying. With crying, if someone gets to the point, crying's totally fine. Ideally, you're giving an instruction at the start of class that sometimes tears come. That's cool. Let them flow. If someone gets to the point that they're not just experiencing some emotion, but they look to be in distress, get everyone into a safe pose, ideally something with eyes down, so something like child's pose. Then make your way over to the person in distress and check in. Maybe they're okay and they're just letting their tears flow. Great. Support them, let them know that's okay. Carry on with your class. If they need support, if you're concerned about someone's mental health or emotional health, don't send them out of the room alone and carry on with your class, okay? Either give your students a task, depending on where you're at in class, you know, take a few vinyasas, rest in shavasana, whatever it is. Or if you're near the end of class and you're really worried, end the class early. Students will understand. So depending on how you manage that, either you're going to leave the students there doing their task and you're going to guide that person outside the room, or you're going to end your class and all the students leave and you stay with that person until you're on your own. And then you're going to get them on the phone with someone who can support them, a friend, a family member, or a mental health service. And stay with them until either it's safe for them to travel on their own or until someone arrives to support them, okay? Sometimes we've been holding it together, especially when we're dealing with some kind of chronic stress. We've been holding it together. Life can keep us distracted, and we go to yoga class and we drop into the body and there's no distractions and things can arise. So we want our students to know we can hold that space for them. So a couple of do's and don'ts before we move off this subject. Do check in on that student later and assure them that these things happen. They're welcome back to class anytime. Someone might feel embarrassed that they've expressed emotions publicly, you know, in a class. And so you want to assure them that, yep, these things happen. You're welcome to come back anytime. If you've ended your class early, or if there's been a lot of disruption to the class, I think it's nice to also check in with the other students to thank them for whatever, making the space, ending early, whatever they've contributed, and for being such a great yoga community. So those are some do's. Some don'ts. Don't give people life advice. Don't tell people you understand. You don't understand, especially if someone's going through something really big. And that can be traumatic for someone. Try not to tell them stories about your own emotional experiences in yoga unless it's super relevant and they really want to know that you've bawled in class. In general, just don't assume or impose or make it about you. Just sit with them. Sit with them, hold space, provide support, and if necessary, get someone from a care team in to, whether that's their personal care team, family, friends, or that's a mental health care team. If this is an area where you want to learn more, you feel concerned about this, or you want to teach to groups of people who might be more likely to have this situation, there's courses called Mental Health First Aid that you can take that are going to give you a lot of skills and strategies and some readiness, kind of like with our medical first aid. It gives you some readiness. It helps you understand what kinds of things can happen and what you're going to be able to do about it, what's within your scope, who do you call when you need help. It's kind of the same with a mental health first aid class. So that's something to maybe put on your list for education. The thing you never want to do is let someone who's in medical distress, emotional distress, mental health distress leave the room alone and you just carry on teaching. That's the thing you never want to do, because that's how people walk out and have a heart attack outside the class or go off in great emotional distress. You want to make sure that they've got someone to care for them. So yeah, so let's move on to talk about another problem often much more commonly happening in class, and that's gigglers. Gigglers or chatters or gossipers in the back of the class. And the first thing I want to say about that is sometimes we're silly. Sometimes we're silly, and silliness is lovely. But if you have students who are creating a lot of disruption, that does need to be addressed. So firstly, I think a good rule of thumb is if students are acting like children, you need to step up and act like a teacher, right? You can't get involved in the giggling, and you often can't ignore it. If other students are starting to look annoyed, you have to take control of the situation. You're responsible for the whole room, and you can't let a couple of people take control of the class or take control of the vibe of your class, right? And I want to acknowledge that both for the students and for you as a teacher, it can feel intimidating and excluding to those who aren't part of the fun. It can feel like you're back in high school. There's a couple of cool kids giggling in the back of the class, and everyone else feels excluded. So that's another reason why it's important to sort of take back control of your class to a certain extent. That can happen in really subtle ways. It can be a look, just make eye contact. That's often enough for students to go, oh yeah, we've gotten out of control. Let's get back to practice. If that doesn't work, you can use some strategies like turn the back of the class into the front of the class, turn students around. That might be the first side of an asymmetrical standing pose, like triangle or side angle or something. You might just say, let's get a different perspective today for balancing, right? And turn everyone around, move around to that side of the class. That can often be enough to put students on notice that let's settle down here and get back to practice. Another strategy is the say it out loud strategy. So if you're having trouble dropping into the pose, if you're having trouble focusing right now, close your eyes, take a few deep breaths, and see if you can refocus. So you're giving everyone that instruction, but it's going to be supportive of the people who've lost their focus for the moment. If it goes on long enough, get all your students into a safe pose and go have a word. And it can be really gentle. It can be really light, like, you seem to be having a great time in class today, and laughter's lovely and always welcome, but let's see if we can keep the disruption down so that everyone can have a practice. And you might even give a suggestion, like if your giggles have taken over your body, if it's beyond your control, go take a break outside, squeeze it all out, and then come on back and refocus, right? I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you're literally out of control with giggles. And if that's what happens, you might need to go outside and have some time and then come on back in. One more thing I want to say about gigglers is sometimes, even though there's several people in the giggle pack, not everyone is as willing a participant as they might appear. So sometimes one of the gigglers is provoking the other. Sometimes one of the gigglers really doesn't want to be giggling. They want to be doing their practice. They're just kind of getting roped in. And if you sense that that's the case, or they really can't control themselves in general, ask them to practice apart, right? Have them shift to different parts of the room. That can usually minimize the giggling from that point on. And you don't want to make it seem like a punishment or you're treating them like children, but sometimes, and it's been my experience, that that's a gift you're giving to the one who really just wants to drop into practice and not be distracted. So that's another strategy that you might employ. You might employ that in the moment, or you might have a quick, kind chat after class. You know what, you guys obviously have a really strong connection, and you bring out the laughter in each other. Maybe for next class, be on other sides of the room so that you can really focus on practice, something like that, right? Is to this is how we enter practice. So, when you arrive, you take off your shoes, you turn off your cell phones, and then we have a period of silence. So that starts with you as a teacher practicing silence. If someone needs a quiet word, of course, have a quiet word. But students start to get into the ritual. The ritual of class is what creates a gateway to consciousness, right? So you take off your shoes, you turn off your phone, you set your baggage aside, you roll out your mat, you lie down. And so that's within your control to a certain extent as a teacher to create that space. It might be a sign at the door, at the entry is now, now we're moving into a period of silence, as you enter the studio. Or it might be the pre-class instructions, when you arrive, take off your shoes, turn off your cell phones, come in. We usually practice silence at the beginning of class so you can lie down, rest, do a few stretches, etc. So you're creating that culture. However, sometimes the culture can get away from you. Sometimes students can run away with your class culture, and then you need to regain it. You need to set some more solid boundaries. If all of this sounds like that's not my teaching style to you, that's okay. You might have a class culture where there's chatting and people are finishing off the last of their lattes at the start of class. That's cool too. It's your class culture. If someone comes in and that's not their jam, they can go find another class. You can refer them to a quieter class if they have concerns about it, right? If you're like, I like both of those things, do both of those things, right? Have a quiet and cozy class and have, yoga to dance music class or whatever it is you want to do, right? Again, you have some control over this as a teacher, right? So you can create a class culture, light the candles, dim the lights, do all the things, play the music, right? Sit in silence. There's nothing more powerful as a teacher than just sitting on your mat with your eyes closed, silent. People will eventually quiet down, right? Like that's what happens. So rather than trying to corral them with your voice, often silence really works. But sometimes there's things that are out of your control. There's noises and sounds and distractions and disruptions that are completely out of your control. And so that's part of our yoga practice. We can't always practice yoga up in the Himalayas, right? Sometimes we have to come down to the marketplace where it's noisy and chaotic. And has what we've learned from yoga, can that help us deal with the chaos? Can we manage our senses? Can we focus our minds? Can we drop into meditation amidst some disturbing sounds, right? So again, it's worth speaking that out loud if that's your circumstance. I remember teaching in a space where it was in a big city and we were upstairs of a new store that was opening and they'd taken out the ceiling of their store. So all that was between my yoga class and this super hip store was just wood. Like there was no ceiling, there was no insulation, nothing to baffle their sound. And they were playing Madonna songs at full blast all day long. And how do you counter that? Do I blast my mantra music at the highest volume? Like, how do you deal with that? So ultimately, and I did try, by the way, ultimately, we had to just speak to it out loud. This is something out of our control. So we're going to make this part of our practice to be able to manage our senses and manage our minds so we don't get carried away into either singing lyrics in our mind or being really aggravated. Both of those things are going to affect our practice. So let's see if we can stay here, right? And again, like speaking it out loud, it might be, especially if you're going to teach in terms, like you're going to teach a 10-week block, or you've got new students, you're teaching a beginner's class or something, at the start of the class to outline, this is what the class culture is. This is what you can expect of me. And this is what I expect of you, right? And so you let people know out loud what the class culture is. I know sometimes I've been shocked because I've been teaching yoga so long, I make assumptions that everyone understands kind of the general yoga class culture rules, for lack of a better word. And sometimes you'll have someone in class who's in the middle of doing yoga and then starts just talking to you. And you're like, oh, we usually don't do that. What do I say about this? Usually we don't just chat. And so how do you introduce students to what your class culture is going to be? That's something to do, again, before class starts. So it might be in your pre-class instructions. You might make a video for students to let them know. And then it's how you conduct yourself through class, right? That shows students what the general behavior is expected to be in class, both from the students and from you as a teacher, right? So if you're telling students to have their cell phones off all the time, you best have your cell phone off. It's very embarrassing when it's your cell phone that starts ringing. Many teachers I know, I'm not saying I'm one of them, but many teachers I know have had their cell phone ring, especially now that we're using our phones to play the music in the class. It's really important that you practice good cell phone control and have your flight mode set if you're going to be playing music through Bluetooth speakers. Otherwise, when your phone rings, it rings through the whole class. So those are just some things to think about. And on the subjects of cell phones, have a rule. Cell phones are off at the start of class, right? Keep them in your bag. And I hear a lot of teachers say, especially for teenagers, I have had just as many grown adults playing on their phones in class as I've had teenagers, right? It's all of us. We're all hooked to our phones. So we want to have a rule. Keep it in your bag, keep it out of sight. However, if you're an emergency contact for a family member and you need your phone with you, if you're in a caring role, if you've got a sick kid at home, whatever, keep your phone, but have it on silent, but vibrate. And here's the thing, put it on a foam block on the mat next to you. Don't put it on the bare wood floor, because if your phone vibrates on the bare wood floor, it's going to make that mooing sound, and everyone's going to hear it. And our nervous systems are so hooked to our phones, everyone's going to be, is it my phone? And it's going to disrupt the whole class. So if someone needs to have their phone nearby, no problem. Just don't have it on the bare floor. Have it up on a foam block or something that's going to mute the sound of that vibration, right? If someone breaks the no phones rule, have a word. Like address it right up front, not publicly, privately, kindly, and maybe use some yoga philosophy. So what yoga philosophy is going to address cell phone use in class? Making right use of your energy, right? Brahmacharya. Making right use of your senses or withdrawal of senses, pratyahara. You might just tell students like, look, you've got an hour to be here, to be in your body, in this moment, in this breath, rather than reaching your energy out into the internet. Keep your energy in the here and now. Your phone will be there for you in an hour, right? It might take students some practice to be able to be away from their phone. And I think that's something worth acknowledging. Yeah. Just as I'm asking students to practice some self-regulation related to their phone, I have to practice some self-regulation with things that might feel distracting or disrespectful or outside my comfort zone. I have to practice some self-regulation with that. Not all students show up how you want them to show up. You don't always like your students. Your students don't always behave themselves. And you have to first and foremost be able to hold a space of metta for yourself and a place of grounding for yourself, and then be able to hold a space of metta for them. If you can't, you should refer them on. They deserve to have a teacher that can hold space for them, however they're showing up. Sometimes students are badly behaved, and if their behavior is only affecting them, I don't worry about it. If their behavior starts to affect other people, that's when it needs to be addressed, but it can always be addressed with loving kindness. It can always be addressed with some tolerance. Like I get that it's hard to set your phone aside. Maybe during yoga class, you need to take the watch off because, we're all so hooked to our phones. Your your watch buzzes on your arm and it's hard to ignore. So maybe for this hour, it's good to set your watch aside. Try it for one class and see if you feel comfortable with that. Right? They are rare. It's not happening every day. That's for sure. So sometimes when it does happen, you're like, you're reading your phone in my class? Like, but yeah, like, yeah, people are reading their phones in your class. People have been reading their phones in my classes for as long as there have been phones. I've caught people have just taking a quick check of their phone and thinking, oh, I'll just quickly text this person back because then when class is over, we'll be able to meet up or whatever. That makes logical sense to them. It's my job as a teacher, not only to hold the space for the whole class and make sure there's no disruptions, but it's my job as a teacher to remind students why we're doing yoga and why we're doing it without our phones. Because, and that might bring up lots of points of yoga philosophy, but one in particular is all day long, we've got all this energy going out into the world. And all day long, we're not present in our bodies. We're present in our thumbs to type out a text. We're watching videos and reading things, and we're at work and we're driving the car. When do we have time to really be with ourselves, right? Like in this moment. So this is 1 hour where you're not reaching your energy out. People aren't entering your mind without your permission through comments on your Instagram or whatever. We're letting all of that go for 1 hour. We're just going to be here and now. And isn't that such a sweet, sweet thing, right? So it's part of our job as a teacher to remind students why they're coming to yoga and to remind them why it's a nice thing to spend an hour without their phone. And it might be something that you have to regularly remind students of, right? It's one of the big processes to me of going from being a yoga student or a dedicated yoga student to dedicated yoga practitioner to being a yoga teacher is starting to experience yoga from a different perspective. Like to be able to understand that yoga feels a certain way in your body, it's going to feel different in someone else's body. That your reasons for going to yoga class may be different than someone else's reasons for going to yoga class. That's a big jump. So it's a great project to start to inquire with the people who are around you. What is it that draws you to yoga? What do you love about yoga class? I was just at the dentist yesterday, and the hygienist asked me what I do, and I told her, and it always, people have to tell me, usually I avoid telling people what I do because of these conversations, but it was a lovely conversation in the end. Oh, that's really nice. You know, my friend told me about restorative yoga, and I thought that was, she didn't say bullshit, but she's like, I thought, like, why would I go and take a nap with other people? I could just like do that at home. I could like go for a walk in the forest and then have a nap on the couch. And I was like, yeah, I hear that. I used to think that an active practice, the doing of yoga was like the thing. I didn't get the point of restorative yoga. I had to try it for myself. And then I asked her, what do you love about restorative yoga? And she told me a whole bunch of things that aren't part of my experience of yoga and that are really important parts of her yoga practice. She has a really dedicated restorative yoga practice and that are very different from my reasons for going to yoga. And that's a great thing to gather up into my teaching philosophy, is understanding that other people are different. Their reasons for practicing yoga are different. Their experience of yoga is so different from mine. And so it's a great project for all of us, is to keep inquiring out there. Like, what is it? Some people go to yoga because it's fun. They like stretching and being bendy and doing fancy tricks. That's as legitimate a reason for going to yoga than someone who wants to meditate for an hour. Like our phones have been designed specifically to prevent us from putting them down. They're like pokey machines or whatever. Like they've been designed to keep us hooked to them. Or like you've been, where's my phone? Where's my phone? Been on your phone, and then you're like, okay, that's enough phone. Whoops. And like suddenly it's in your hand again. Like, how? I thought I put it down. How is it? Is it on one of those retractable cords? We're hooked to our phones. And for some students, they really need support in setting them down and leaving them down for an hour.
I think
That's it. Some of us are hooked to our phones, not all of us. So it's trying to understand in relationship to that from the other person's perspective.
Yeah, and that it might be really uncomfortable for them to not have their phone. Like you might have a rule of, don't let me go over time here. You might have a rule of cell phones stay in bags, but some students might not be comfortable with that. Like that might be too deep a stretch at the start of their yoga practice. They might need to have their phone next to them. And that's, as long as it doesn't disturb anyone else, that's okay. Hopefully with practice, they can strengthen enough to be able to leave their phone in the bag. It might be something that you and that student quietly work on together. Like, I know it's really hard to leave your phone in your bag. So for today, have your phone next to you and try to have it on silent. Turn it upside down so it doesn't distract you. Maybe next class, we can leave it at the back of the room or something. But for today, go ahead and have your phone there. I know that that's really hard. This is something we can work towards together. And for people who are extremely online, having a break from notifications, from like someone commented, what did they say? Like the tension of that. Is it going to be a positive comment? Is it going to be a negative comment? Is it going to be a troll? Like that tension can be really detrimental to someone's health on all levels: physical health, mental health, emotional health. So being a support to give them a 1 hour, however long it's going to be, space from their phone and from not only your energy going out through the phone, but also what energies are coming in, and being able to have maybe that little bit of control of what you're going to take in for an hour can be really nice as well, right? And that's particularly important for people who are extremely online. And more, as every year passes, more and more of our students are going to be extremely online. These are people whose jobs are online. Maybe they've got a side hustle as an influencer. All their communications are happening online. So being able to develop the skills to step away from that and have a break from that can be a really great purpose for yoga. Like your phone is a great tool, but it can also be a really bad friend, right? Like constantly in your ear when you're trying to do other things. So developing some and even if you don't talk about phones ever, know that in yoga, as we develop self-regulation skills, those self-regulation skills will translate to other areas of our lives, like in how we use technology, right? So a big part of our yoga practice is in developing self-regulation. Some people can come into class and relax immediately. That's great. Others of us need a lot of training. We need a lot of training to tune out from the outside world, to stop writing grocery lists and emails and planning for tomorrow and thinking about yesterday. We need a lot of practice at that, and we need someone to hold space for that, right? And so that's your job as a yoga teacher, to hold space for everyone that comes, however they come, and give them some tools to develop that self-regulation and to have some joyful time and movement and some sweet time and relaxation, right? Well, you know, it's funny, as a student, you often don't see some of the class management issues that your teacher is dealing with in class. Like you're just there on your mat doing your thing and you don't know that there's this thing happening and that thing happening. it's so useful to hear experiences from the real world. So I really appreciate you bringing your stories from the front line back to our discussions. One of the things that, sorry, I'm about to go slightly over time, but one of the things that happens as we develop our practice is we start to forget what real people are like. They're not thinking about yoga all day long. They're not working on their handstand. They just come to yoga class, they do their practice and they leave, right? And so it's good to have reminders of what real people are like. They how they show up to class, how they engage in class, how much they want to hear about yoga from you, which is a little bit, and what you can do to encourage them to come back and give them a little bit more. Yeah, so I hope this has been helpful. Sorry, I've gone on a skosh over time. Next week, we'll talk about risk management and what to do when there's medical emergencies, and what to do for people who have accessibility needs, what to do if people need to bring their service animals to your class. We'll talk about all of that next week. For now, thank you so much. Thanks for those who joined me for the discussion. Hello to those of you who are listening to the recording. So wonderful to have you all in my yoga community. See y'all next week.